why Stone Age women had more freedom than medieval women. History for sleep. There is a quiet assumption buried deep inside the way we tell history. It is the assumption that the further back you go, the harder life was for women, that ancient times meant ancient oppression, that primitive meant powerless, that the long walk of human civilization has been, for women, a slow and steady climb, from darkness toward light. And in some ways, that story is true, but in other ways it is not. In other ways, if you look carefully at the evidence left behind in bones and fire pits and ancient graves, in the teeth of people who lived 40,000 years ago, and in the genetic record written into our cells across hundreds of thousands of years, you begin to see something unexpected. You begin to see that for most of human history, for the vast majority of the 200,000 years our species has existed on this earth, women occupied a social position that was in certain meaningful ways more equal, more mobile, and more autonomous than what came much later. And that raises a quiet question, not a political question, not a simple one, but a genuinely curious one. What happened? And why does the archaeological record suggest that the lives of women in the deep human past were shaped by forces quite different from the ones that would come to dominate much later, during the centuries of feudal Europe, of agricultural empires, of walls and titles and inheritance laws? This is a question worth sitting with slowly. It is a question that requires patience and a willingness to let the evidence speak before the conclusion arrives. Let us begin at the beginning, not the beginning of recorded history, which is itself only a thin sliver of time, barely 5,000 years of writing out of a human story that stretches back 200,000 years. Let us begin at the true beginning, or as close to it as the archaeological record allows. Let us begin with the Pleistocene, the great age of ice and grassland and megafauna, when the human animal first emerged as something recognizable, when small bands of people moved across landscapes that were not yet named, following rivers that no map had ever traced, sleeping under skies that no city had yet illuminated. These early people, the ones we call hunter-gatherers, lived in groups that were typically small. Most estimates from both archaeological evidence and from studies of more recent hunter-gatherer societies suggest that a band consisted of somewhere between 20 and 50 individuals, though larger groups might gather seasonally, when food was abundant, and then disperse again when resources grew thin. These were not armies, they were not villages. They were extended families and loose alliances of families, moving together through a landscape they understood intimately, and whose rhythms they had learned to read the way we read language, automatically in the background of every waking moment. And within those groups, the question of how women lived is one that anthropologists and archaeologists have been piecing together for decades, drawing on evidence that is sometimes frustratingly incomplete, but that, when assembled carefully, tells a story worth hearing. One of the most important things the archaeological record suggests is that in early hunter-gatherer societies, the division of labour between men and women, while real, was not the rigid and absolute hierarchy that would come to define many later agricultural societies. Both men and women contributed to the survival of the group. Women gathered plant foods, roots, tubers, berries, seeds, nuts and insects, which in most hunter-gatherer environments provided the majority of the calories the group consumed. This is not a trivial observation. In many regions and across many seasons, plant foods gathered primarily by women formed the nutritional foundation of the entire band. The men hunted, and meat was prized and important, especially for its protein and fat content. But if you measured the actual caloric contribution of each activity in most environments, the gathering done by women was often as significant or more significant than the hunting done by men. This economic reality had consequences. When a person contributes substantially and visibly to the survival of the group, their social standing tends to reflect that contribution. This is not a universal rule, and human societies have found many creative ways to undervalue the labour of women even when that labour is objectively essential. But in small, mobile groups, where the contribution of every individual was immediately and practically visible, where there were no abstract economic systems to obscure who was doing what, the connection between contribution and standing was more direct than it would become in the layered and institutionalized economies of later civilizations. From an evolutionary perspective, the conditions of hunter-gatherer life created pressures that did not necessarily favor extreme male dominance. The groups were small enough that every adult member mattered. There was no surplus wealth to accumulate and defend. There were no inherited estates or titles. There was no system of land ownership that could be passed down through patrilineal inheritance. There was, in many cases, a kind of structural levelling that made extreme and permanent hierarchy difficult to maintain. This does not mean that hierarchy was absent. It was present. But it was hierarchy of a different kind than what would emerge with agriculture and settlement, more personal, more contested, more subject to the daily negotiations of people who knew each other intimately and depended on each other for survival. If we look deeper into the anthropological evidence, we find something that has surprised many researchers. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, groups that have maintained aspects of their traditional way of life into the modern era, suggest that women in these communities often enjoy a degree of personal autonomy that contrasts sharply with what was available to women in many historical agricultural societies. This includes the ability to choose their own partners, to dissolve unsatisfactory partnerships, to move freely within and sometimes between groups, and to participate meaningfully in group decision-making. The work of anthropologist Kim Hill and others studying groups like the Ai of Paraguay and the Hadza of Tanzania has revealed patterns that appear again and again across geographically distant hunter-gatherer populations. Women in these societies have recognized social voices, their opinions on where the group should move, when to leave a depleted foraging area, how to respond to conflict with neighbouring bands carry genuine weight. Not absolute weight, not always equal weight, but genuine weight. They are not invisible. They are not simply the property of their fathers or husbands. They are recognised members of the community with standing that derives from their own labour, their own knowledge, and their own relationships. This does not mean that hunter-gatherer life was a paradise of gender equality. It was not. Violence against women existed. Male dominance in certain spheres of social life was common. The physical dangers of life in the Pleistocene did not distribute themselves equally across men and women, but the specific mechanisms of female subordination that would come to define many later civilizations, the legal ownership of women by men, the inheritance of women as property, the absolute prohibition on female economic activity, the complete removal of women from public life, these were not yet in place. They could not be in the structural conditions of mobile hunter-gatherer existence. The social technology to create and maintain them had not yet been invented. To understand why this matters, it's worth considering what those structural conditions actually were. A mobile band cannot accumulate the kind of material surplus that creates wealth. Inequality. You can only carry what you can carry. Every few days or weeks or months, the group moves, and everything that cannot be carried must be left behind or given away. There are no warehouses. There are no granaries. There are no stone walls enclosing land that belongs to one family and not another. The landscape is shared, at least within the territory recognized by the band, and in many cases even territorial boundaries are permeable and negotiated rather than absolute and enforced by permanent institutions. In this kind of world, wealth cannot be inherited in the way it can in settled agricultural societies. A man who was a successful hunter cannot pass his hunting grounds to his son in any permanent or legally enforceable way. A woman who knew the best locations of plant foods, who understood the seasonal movements of edible roots and the locations of water sources during the dry season, carried that knowledge in her own mind. It could be shared, taught, passed down through relationship and patient instruction, but could not be confiscated by a husband or transferred to a new owner through a marriage contract drawn up by men who regarded her as property. This matters because so much of the subordination of women in later historical periods was tied directly to the emergence of property, inheritance, and the need of propertied men to control the reproductive choices of women in order to ensure that their property passed to their own biological children. When land and livestock and stored grain became the foundation of wealth, and when that wealth could be accumulated across generations, the question of paternity became economically urgent in a way that it was not in mobile hunter-gatherer life. And when paternity became economically urgent, the bodies of women became the site of an intense social anxiety. Who had access to a woman's reproductive capacity? Who could guarantee that the children she bore were the children of the man whose property they would inherit? These questions, which seem abstract when phrased this way, had concrete and often brutal consequences for real women living in real historical societies across the agricultural world. The emergence of agriculture, which began roughly 10,000 years ago in several parts of the world, first in the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia, then independently in China, in Mesoamerica, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in other regions, is often described as one of the greatest advances in human history. And in terms of raw material productivity, in terms of the ability to support larger populations and to generate the surplus that made possible writing and cities and specialized labor and monumental architecture, it was indeed transformative beyond any earlier development in human social organization. But the transition to agriculture was not uniformly beneficial for everyone, and the evidence suggests that it was often particularly costly for women. The physical evidence from skeletal remains is striking and has been accumulating steadily in the decades since bioarchaeology became a mature scientific discipline. When archaeologists compare the bones of people from hunter-gatherer populations with those of early agricultural populations in the same regions, they consistently find that the farmers were in worse physical health. They were shorter on average, because their diets, though more abundant in certain carbohydrates, were less diverse in nutrients than the varied diets of foragers who ate from hundreds of different plant and animal species. They showed more evidence of dental decay, because the shift to grain-heavy diets changed the bacterial environment of the mouth in ways that promoted cavities. They showed more evidence of infectious disease because living in permanent settlements with domesticated animals and accumulated waste created conditions that facilitated the spread of pathogens in ways that mobile bands rarely had to contend with. But within this general pattern of declining health at the transition to agriculture, women often fared worse than men in specific ways. the isotopic analysis of ancient bones, which can reveal information about diet by analysing the chemical signatures of different foods preserved in the mineral structure of bone, has shown in some populations that women and men were eating differently, with women sometimes having less access to the high-quality protein foods that supported better health outcomes. The repetitive physical labour of early agricultural life, including the grinding of grain with stone tools, left distinctive wear patterns on the bones of women's hands and spines, evidence of hours upon hours of the same motion performed across a lifetime of labour that was not distributed according to ability or preference, but according to gender. The bones speak if you know how to listen to them. They record a life of extraordinary physical demand concentrated in specific repetitive motions. The grinder, the carrier, the water fetcher, the cloth maker. These were not the varied physical activities of a mobile forager who walked long distances, climbed, dug, processed, and carried a wide diversity of materials in a wide variety of postures. They were the narrowing of physical life into channels that left permanent marks in the skeleton. Marks of work that was never quite finished, never quite enough, always beginning again the next morning before the light came. Let us now turn to medieval Europe specifically, because the contrast between Stone Age life and medieval life is not simply a contrast between ancient and less ancient. It is contrast between two very different social systems, two very different ways of organising human life and human relationships, and the differences had profound consequences for women who lived within them. Medieval Europe was not a monolith. It spanned roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the beginning of the early modern period in the late 15th century. It encompassed an enormous diversity of local customs, regional laws, and social arrangements. A peasant woman in 13th century France lived a life that differed in many specific ways from a peasant woman in contemporaneous England or Poland, or the lands bordering the Mediterranean. A noblewoman had access to resources and social power that a serf could not dream of. The medieval world was complex and varied, and any generalization about it must be held with appropriate care. But across much of this variation, there were structural features of medieval European society that placed women in positions of systematic legal and social subordination in ways that would have been largely absent from the lives of Pleistocene hunter-gatherer women. Understanding these structural features helps illuminate what was actually at stake in the long historical transformation that separated the Stone Age from the medieval period. The first and perhaps most foundational of these structural features was the legal status of women in medieval Europe, which in most regions and most legal traditions was significantly curtailed compared to that of men. Under the system of coverture, which was widely practiced in various forms across medieval European legal traditions, a married woman did not exist as a separate legal person. Her legal identity was subsumed into that of her husband. She could not own property independently. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name in most circumstances. The property she brought to a marriage, including any inheritance from her own family, passed under her husband's control upon marriage, and remained there unless extraordinary circumstances intervened. This was not simply a matter of custom or social expectation. It was encoded in law, enforced by courts, and supported by religious doctrine. The theological framework that dominated medieval European thought, rooted in the writings of church fathers from Augustine to Thomas Aquinas, provided intellectual justifications for the subordination of women that had the force of divine sanction. Women were associated with the body, with appetite, with the dangerous and unruly forces that threatened spiritual and social order. Men were associated with reason and with the spirit. The proper ordering of society in this view required that the rational govern the appetitive, which meant that men should govern women, just as the soul should govern the body, just as God governed creation. This is not to say that medieval women had no power, no agency, and no meaningful lives. Many did, and the history of medieval women is full of remarkable individuals who found ways to exercise intelligence and will and creative force within and sometimes against the constraints of their world. Abbesses led powerful religious institutions that gave some women access to education, administrative authority, and spiritual prestige unavailable in the secular world. Hildegard of Bingen composed music, wrote theology, conducted correspondence with popes and emperors, and described visionary experiences of extraordinary originality and power. Christine de Pizan became one of the first professional writers in European history, earning a living with her pen in an intellectual world that was almost entirely male. Eleanor of Aquitaine exercised political influence across decades and two kingdoms in ways that defied any simple categorization of medieval women as passive and powerless. But these were exceptional individuals, and their exceptionalism is itself part of the story. The fact that we remember them individually, the fact that their achievements stand out against a background of medieval history as remarkable, precisely because they were unusual, tells us something important about the ordinary conditions against which they were remarkable. They were exceptions to a system. The system was not built for them. It was built for men, and the women who succeeded within or against it did so through the force of particular circumstances, particular talents, and particular configurations of luck that the vast majority of medieval women could not access. Noble women could exercise significant power in the absence of male relatives, managing estates, and even leading military defences in times of conflict. As several historical examples from across medieval Europe demonstrate, tradeswomen and craftswomen participated actively in the economic life of medieval towns and cities, particularly in certain guilds and trades where female participation had established precedent. Widows, freed from the constraints of coverture by the deaths of their husbands, sometimes enjoyed a degree of legal and economic autonomy that married women could not access. But these were partial exceptions to a broader system in which the structural position of women was one of legal and social dependence, and the everyday reality for most women. The peasant women who constituted the vast majority of the medieval European population was one of hard physical labour, legal invisibility, vulnerability to violence, and almost no practical recourse against the authority of fathers, husbands, or lords. For these women, the distance between their lives and the lives of women in the Stone Age was not primarily a distance of material comfort, though the material differences were real. It was a distance in the architecture of social power, in who could speak and be heard, in who owned the ground on which daily life was lived. To compare this to the life of a Pleistocene woman is not to romanticize prehistoric existence. The dangers of a hunter-gatherer life were real and immediate. Predation, injury, illness without medical care, violence between groups, the constant physical demands of moving through a landscape that offered no guaranteed shelter and no certain food supply. These were not trivial hardships. A woman living 40,000 years ago faced physical risks that most women in medieval Europe would never encounter in the same form. her life was likely shorter on average. Her infant mortality rate was high, as was the rate of mortality associated with childbirth itself. The losses she experienced across a lifetime were likely staggering by modern standards. But the specific forms of social subordination that characterized medieval European life, the legal non-existence, the theological justification of female inferiority, the systematic exclusion from public life and decision-making, the treatment of women's bodies as property to be transferred between men through marriage contracts and dowry arrangements, these were not features of hunter-gatherer life. They were, in a meaningful historical sense, inventions. They were social technologies developed within the context of settled agricultural civilization, refined and institutionalized across the centuries as state formation and organized religion, and they had consequences that were qualitatively different from the hardships of Pleistocene survival. One of the most illuminating ways to think about this difference is through the concept of social embeddedness. In a small hunter-gatherer band, every individual was embedded in a dense network of relationships that were personal, direct, and long-standing. You knew everyone around you, they knew you. Your contributions were visible to everyone in the group. Your suffering was visible. Your capabilities were visible. There was no anonymity, no bureaucracy, no legal abstraction that could render you invisible as a person. This did not prevent mistreatment. It did not guarantee kindness or justice. Human beings are capable of cruelty in intimate settings, as well as in anonymous ones. But it did create a social environment in which your existence as a person with needs and knowledge and relationships was impossible to ignore entirely, because you were present, breathing, working, speaking every day in a space small enough that everyone could see you. In medieval European society, particularly for peasant women, the opposite could be true in important ways. The legal and religious systems that govern social life were explicitly designed to abstract away the individuality of women and to treat them as categories rather than persons. The category of wife, the category of daughter, the category of widow, the category of nun, each came with prescribed behaviours and prescribed limitations that applied to all women in the category regardless of individual circumstance, individual capability, or individual preference. The individual woman within the category was less important than the category itself, because the category was what the legal and theological system needed to manage and control in order to reproduce the social order across generations. From an evolutionary perspective, this degree of social abstraction and systematic categorization would have been entirely alien to the cognitive and social world of a Pleistocene human. Our brains evolved in the context of small groups where social relationships were personal and direct, where status was negotiated face to face across a lifetime of interactions, where the contributions and needs of every group member were immediately perceivable without the mediation of abstract institutional structures. The vast impersonal systems of medieval social organization, the church with its hierarchy stretching from parish priest to pope, the feudal system with its chains of obligation and dependency reaching from serf to king, the codified law with its categories and procedures and courts, were evolutionary novelties that created forms of social experience that had no precedent in the long ancestral past. This evolutionary mismatch between our ancient social psychology and the demands of large-scale hierarchical civilization is something that researchers across multiple disciplines have been exploring in recent decades. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt, The anthropologist Joseph Henrich and many others have written about the ways in which the social and cognitive demands of large-scale civilization differ from the conditions in which human psychology evolved, and the ways in which these mismatches produce characteristic strains and distortions in human social life. And while it is important not to oversimplify, not to suggest that modern or historical civilization is simply wrong or unnatural in comparison to some idealized ancestral state, the mismatch is real and its consequences are worth taking seriously. For women specifically, the mismatch between the social world our psychology evolved within and the social world of medieval Europe had some specific and measurable consequences. The research of psychologist Sarah Blaffer-Baptiste on the evolution of maternal behaviour and female social strategies in primates suggests that the capacity for female coalition building, for female social influence, and for female agency in reproductive decision-making is deeply rooted in primate biology and in the evolutionary history of our lineage stretching back millions of years. These capacities did not simply disappear in medieval Europe. They were present in every woman who lived then, rooted in the same neural architecture and hormonal systems that shaped them in our Pleistocene ancestors. But the social structures of medieval European life worked systematically against their expression in the public and legal sphere, channeling them instead into the private and informal, into the domestic spaces and female networks that existed beneath and alongside the official structures of church and law and feudal hierarchy. Let us consider for a moment what the daily life of a peasant woman in, say, 13th century France might have looked like, and how it might have compared to the daily life of a woman in a hunter-gatherer band on the African savannah 30,000 years earlier. This is a thought experiment that requires some imagination and some humility about what we can and cannot know across such distances of time and culture. But the general outlines are available to us from the archaeological and historical evidence, and the comparison is worth making carefully. The 13th century French peasant woman rose before dawn, in a house that was likely small, dark, and shared not only with her husband and children, but possibly with livestock as well, particularly in winter when the body heat of animals provided a form of heating that no other technology available to her could replicate. Her day was structured around the agricultural calendar, the planting and harvest cycles of crops that the entire community depended upon, cycles that were themselves dependent on weather patterns and soil conditions, and the rhythms of seasons that showed no regard for human preference or human need. She worked in the fields alongside her husband and children during planting and harvest, performing labour that was physically demanding and unrelenting. She managed the household, which in a peasant context meant not just cooking and childcare, but the production of cloth from raw fibre, which involved the laborious processes of carding and spinning and weaving that occupied countless hours that were technically not field labour, but were no less exhausting. She tended a kitchen garden that supplemented the family's diet with vegetables and herbs. She managed small livestock, often chickens and perhaps a pig, whose care was women's work in most medieval European communities. She preserved food for winter through drying, salting and fermentation, using techniques that had been passed down through generations of women before her, and that represented a substantial body of practical knowledge. These were substantial and skilled activities that required knowledge, physical endurance and careful management of limited resources, and their economic value to the family and the community was real and considerable. But outside the physical labour of her daily life, Her social world was circumscribed in ways that would have been quite foreign to her Pleistocene predecessor. She had little or no formal voice in the governance of her community. The village community was managed by men within a feudal hierarchy that was itself managed by men, within a church structure that was managed by men. Her own legal existence was defined by her relationship to the men in her life. As a daughter, she was under her father's authority in matters of property, marriage, and most legal affairs. As a wife, she was under a husband's authority, in a legal sense that is not merely nominal but enforced by courts and by social custom that had behind it centuries of accumulated weight. As a widow, she had more autonomy, but only if she did not remarry, and the social and economic pressures to remarry were often considerable, particularly for women with young children and no independent means of support. Her relationship to her own body was mediated by religious doctrine that treated female sexuality as dangerous and potentially corrupting, that required female purity as a condition of social respectability, and that provided institutional structures, from confession to canon law to local church courts, for monitoring and punishing sexual behaviour that deviated from prescribed norms. The double standard was not merely informal or a matter of private opinion. It was institutionalized in church law, in secular law, and in the social customs of communities that policed female behaviour with a vigilance that had no equivalent application to men. A woman who engaged in extramarital sexual activity faced consequences, social, legal, and sometimes physical, that a man in similar circumstances was unlikely to face to the same degree or in the same forms. Now consider the woman on the African savannah in a band of perhaps 30 or 35 people, some in a time before writing, before cities, before law codes, before the concept of property as something that could be owned across generations and transferred through formal legal mechanisms. She woke when the light came, or before it, if the sounds of the night suggested that predators were active or that the camp needed attention. Her day was shaped not by an agricultural calendar fixed to a settled landscape, but by the immediate needs of the band and the seasonal patterns of a landscape she knew with the intimacy of lifelong familiarity. She gathered food, which required not merely physical effort, but a sophisticated cognitive engagement with the natural world, knowing which plants were edible in which season, which roots could be located by reading subtle surface indicators, which berries were ripe and which were not, which areas had been harvested recently and needed to rest. This knowledge was acquired over years of direct experience and observation, refined through conversation with the older women who had spent more decades at this landscape and who carried in their memories a map of its resources through multiple seasonal cycles and multiple years of abundance and scarcity. It was genuine expertise, the kind of expertise that could not be acquired quickly or casually, and it was expertise that every adult woman in the band possessed in some meaningful degree. She walked long distances, sometimes many miles in a single day, carrying baskets and tools, and when her children were young, carrying the children themselves in the way that primates have carried their young for millions of years. She participated in the social life of the camp, the conversation and laughter and dispute resolution and storytelling that seems to be a universal feature of small group human life everywhere. It has been observed in every culture and on every continent. Human beings, when they live in small groups, talk. They tell stories about the day and about the past and about the people they know. They argue and reconcile. They make each other laugh. They mourn together and celebrate together. This is not a minor fact about human life. It is one of the most important facts about human life, and it was fully present in the camp of the Pleistocene hunter-gatherer band in ways that the isolated household of a medieval peasant woman who spent many of her working hours alone or with her immediate family rather than embedded in a broader social group might not always replicate. Her knowledge of the landscape was specific, detailed, and socially valuable in a way that gave her genuine standing within the group. Not theoretical standing, not standing derived from her relationship to a man, standing derived from what she personally knew and could do. This knowledge was a form of intellectual capital that belonged to her in a very direct and personal way that could not be taken from her by legal mechanisms or social custom, that lived in her mind and was expressed in her actions every day. Her relationships with the other members of her band were face-to-face and longer standing. She knew her campmates as individuals, with their particular strengths and weaknesses, their particular histories, and the web of relationships and obligations that connected them to each other. When conflicts arose, as they inevitably did in groups of people living in close proximity under sometimes desperate conditions, they were resolved through the direct social mechanisms of a small group, negotiation, coalition building, the pressure of collective opinion, the intervention of respected elders, the threat of social exclusion from a group that everyone in it needed for survival. She had a voice in these processes, not necessarily an equal voice to that of the senior men of the group, but a real voice, rooted in her own relationships and her often demonstrated competence, and her own history within the group. Her choice of partners was shaped by the expectations and preferences of her group, and the limited pool of available individuals, and it would be wrong to imagine that Pleistocene women made romantic choices in isolation from social pressure. But it was also shaped by her own preferences in ways that the formal marriage arrangements of agricultural societies, in which marriage was primarily an economic and political transaction between families, often did not allow. The evidence from hunter-gatherer studies suggests that women in these societies exercised meaningful choice in partner selection, that partnerships that proved unsatisfactory could be dissolved without the legal and social catastrophe that divorce represented in medieval Europe, and that a woman who left one partnership could, in many cases, form a new one without permanent social stigma. This is not a minor point. The ability to exit an unsatisfactory or dangerous relationship is a form of freedom that has profound consequences for the quality of daily life and for the physical and psychological safety of the person who has or does not have that ability. In medieval Europe, the exit from marriage was effectively closed for most women. Annulment was possible in certain narrow circumstances defined by church law, primarily when it could be demonstrated that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, but it required church approval and was practically inaccessible to most peasant women who lacked the resources, the legal knowledge, and the social connections to navigate the ecclesiastical court system successfully. Separation could occur in cases of extreme and documented cruelty, but the social and economic consequences fell heavily on the woman, who in most cases had no independent means of support and no legal standing to assert her own interests. Divorce in the modern sense simply did not exist as a legal option for most of medieval European history. A woman who had made a poor marriage, whether through her own choice or through the arrangements of her family, had made it for life. The law provided her no practical escape route, and the Church actively discouraged her from seeking one, teaching that the suffering of an unhappy marriage was itself a spiritual discipline, a participation in the suffering of Christ, an opportunity for the kind of patient endurance that the Church held up as the highest expression of female virtue. This combination of legal constraint and economic dependence created a structural vulnerability that had no precise equivalent in hunter-gatherer life. A Pleistocene woman living in a difficult social situation had options, none of them easy or guaranteed, but real options. She could appeal to the social community of the band, which had a direct interest in the social harmony and functional cooperation of all its members, and which therefore had practical reasons to intervene in conflicts that threatened that harmony. She could seek the support of female relatives and allies, who in a band-based society were often literally present in the daily life of the community, in a way that the dispersed family structures of medieval agricultural settlements sometimes made impossible. She could, in extreme cases, seek incorporation into another band, though this was a serious and potentially dangerous step that carried its own risks and costs. None of these options were guaranteed. None of them made the hardship of a difficult relationship simply disappear, but they existed. The social world of a small band, for all its intimacy and exposure, was not a closed system with locked doors and a divine sanction on the locking. The medieval peasant woman's social world was, in certain crucial respects, exactly that kind of closed system. The legal system locked certain doors and handed the keys to men. The economic system locked others, making women's material survival dependent on their relationships with men in ways that made exit practically impossible even when it was theoretically available. The religious system provided ideological justification for locks, and taught women to regard the locked doors as natural, as divinely ordained, as the proper ordering of a world created and governed by a God who had explicitly, in the sacred texts that anchored medieval European civilization, described woman as created from and for man. This ideological dimension of medieval female subordination is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it has no precise equivalent in the Pleistocene. Hunter-gatherer societies had cosmologies and spiritual practices. They had stories about the origins of the world and the nature of the powers that governed it. Shamanic traditions, ancestor veneration, ritual practices surrounding birth and death and the hunt. All of these were present in various forms across hunter-gatherer societies worldwide. But the development of systematic theology, of large institutional religions with professional clergy, written doctrines enforced across vast populations, and the capacity to coordinate belief and practice across centuries of time was a product of settled civilization. And in medieval Europe, the particular theological tradition that dominated public and intellectual life became one of the primary mechanisms through which female subordination was reproduced and legitimized across generations. When a woman grows up in a society that teaches her from childhood, through the authority of the church that is the dominant institution in her world, that her subordinate status is not a human invention but a divine command, that the proper ordering of the world requires her obedience to male authority, that her own spiritual development depends on embracing humility and submission as virtues rather than resisting them as impositions, the psychological and social effects are profound and deeply difficult to disentangle from simple personal experience and personal conviction. The ideology does not need external enforcement when it has been successfully internalized. It becomes part of the way a person understands herself and the world she lives in, part of the conceptual vocabulary through which she interprets her own experience, and this makes it far more effective and far more durable than any external enforcement alone could be. A Pleistocene woman did not have this particular burden. She lived in a world where the social arrangements she experienced were clearly human arrangements, negotiated and renegotiated through the daily interactions of a small community of people she knew personally. The authority of senior men was real and sometimes heavy, and it would be wrong to pretend that Pleistocene women never experienced the weight of male authority or the constraints it imposed. But it was not God. It was not the cosmic order. It was not the divine sanction of a revealed religion backed by 1,000 years of institutional authority. It was people making decisions in conditions of uncertainty. The social dynamics of a small group created at least some accountability for those decisions in ways that the vast impersonal systems of medieval Europe, in which a woman's subordination was encoded in law, in scripture, in theological commentary and social custom, and in the economic realities of agricultural life, simply did not. The archaeological evidence for these conclusions is not always direct. We cannot excavate the inner lives of Pleistocene women. We cannot read what they thought or how they felt about their social position. But we can read the material record they left behind, and in recent decades that record has become increasingly rich and increasingly surprising in what it reveals about the social lives of ancient people. One of the most significant developments in paleoanthropology in recent years has been the recognition that grave goods and burial practices, the items placed with the dead and the care with which bodies were interred, can tell us a great deal about the social status of the individuals buried. And the evidence from Pleistocene and early post-Pleistocene burials is striking in several respects that are relevant to the question of how women were regarded. At the site of Sunged in Russia, which dates to approximately 30,000 years before the present, archaeologists discovered the graves of several individuals buried with extraordinary quantities of mammoth ivory beads, carved implements, and other objects that must have represented significant labour investments to produce. Among these individuals was a young girl, buried with a level of care and material richness comparable to that of the adult males in the same burial site. This is not conclusive evidence of gender equality in Pleistocene society. A single grave, however richly furnished, cannot by itself tell us about the general social standing of women in the society that created it. But it is evidence against the simple assumption that female individuals were systematically valued less than males in all aspects of Pleistocene social life, and it contributes to a picture that, taken as a whole, suggests more social complexity and more variability in gender relations than the simple narrative of universal prehistoric male dominance would predict. At other Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe and Central Asia, the evidence of what appear to be female figurines, the objects that archaeologists have long called Venus figurines, has prompted decades of scholarly debate that shows no sign of reaching a final conclusion. These small carved objects, created from ivory, stone, and fired clay across a geographic range spanning from Western Europe to Siberia, and a time range spanning tens of thousands of years, depict women with features that have been interpreted in many different ways, as fertility symbols created by men for ritual purposes connected to reproduction, as self-representations by female artists, which the analysis of finger impressions at some clay figurine sites has been argued to support, as objects of religious significance connected to female spiritual roles in Paleolithic communities, as marks of a social world in which female reproductive capacity was publicly acknowledged and invested with cultural importance. The debate continues, and no single interpretation has achieved consensus, but the existence of these objects created with care and skill across such vast geographic and temporal ranges, is itself evidence that the female body and the female experience were not invisible or culturally irrelevant in Pleistocene life. The genetic evidence, which has become increasingly detailed and informative in recent decades with advances in the extraction and analysis of ancient DNA from skeletal remains, adds another layer to this picture. Studies of the mobility patterns of ancient populations, inferred from comparing the genetic signatures of individuals buried in different locations and from different ancestral backgrounds, have revealed something unexpected about the social organization of some early human groups. In many of these populations, the evidence suggests that it was women who moved between groups more frequently than men, a pattern consistent with patrilocal residence, where women moved to join their husbands' groups after forming partnerships. But in other populations, the evidence suggests bilateral or even matrilocal patterns, where movement was more balanced between the sexes, or where men moved to join women's groups. This variability itself is significant. It suggests that there was no single fixed pattern of female mobility and social organization in the deep human past, that different groups in different environments and at different times organized themselves in different ways that reflected local conditions, local histories, and local choices. This flexibility, this adaptive responsiveness to local conditions, is itself a form of social freedom compared to the rigid legal and institutional structures that would later constrain social organization in settled agricultural civilizations where the rules were written down and enforced by courts and clergy. When we think about what it meant to be a woman across these different historical periods, it is tempting to look for simple narratives, comfortable stories with clear moral arcs, the story of continuous progress. Things were bad, then less bad, then less bad still, moving toward the good, or the counter-narrative of a golden age followed by decline. Things were once good and equal, then civilization came and everything got worse. Neither of these stories is quite right, and both of them distort the actual complexity of what the evidence shows. The reality is that different historical contexts created different sets of constraints and different sets of freedoms, and that the specific freedoms available in Pleistocene hunter-gatherer life were real freedoms, meaningful freedoms, freedoms that shape the texture of daily experience in ways that matter, even when we measure them against the material hardships that accompany them. The freedom to move through a landscape without asking permission, without presenting documentation, without crossing a boundary enforced by someone else's claim of ownership. The freedom to contribute visibly and directly to the survival of your community and to have that contribution recognized by the people around you in real time. The freedom to participate in the social dynamics of a small group where your voice and your relationships had direct and immediate weight, where decisions were made in your presence, rather than in abstract institutions from which you were excluded. The freedom to exit difficult partnership without legal catastrophe and economic ruin. The freedom from an ideological system that taught you that your subordination was the will of a god who had created the universe, and whose commands could not be questioned without spiritual peril. These were not trivial freedoms. They were the kinds of freedoms that shaped daily experience at the most fundamental level, that determined whether a person woke up each morning as the recognized subject of her own life, or as a managed category in someone else's system. Medieval European women had different freedoms and different constraints, and it would be wrong to deny that some of the freedoms available in medieval Europe were real and significant. Some women had access to forms of knowledge, spiritual life, and institutional power that no Pleistocene woman could have imagined. The abbess governing a large and wealthy convent was exercising a form of administrative and spiritual authority over a complex institution, managing lands, finances, and the religious lives of many individuals that had no equivalent in a hunter-gatherer band. The educated noblewoman with access to a library of Latin texts was participating in an intellectual tradition of remarkable depth and breadth that stretched back through centuries of preserved thought to the ancient world. The merchant's widow, managing a prosperous trading business, was operating in an economic context of extraordinary sophistication and possibility that would have been simply inconceivable to her Pleistocene ancestor. But these were partial and exceptional forms of freedom, available to a small minority of women in circumstances that required particular configurations of birth, luck, and survival. For the vast majority of medieval women, the peasant women who constituted perhaps 80 or 90% of the total population of medieval Europe, the daily reality was one of physical labour, legal dependence, and structural vulnerability that was in many specific and measurable ways more constraining than the lives of women in the Pleistocene. This is a quiet and somewhat melancholy observation, but it is one that the evidence, patiently assembled across decades of archaeological and anthropological research by scholars who had no particular agenda to advance and who often arrived at their conclusions with considerable surprise, seems to support. And it is worth sitting with that observation rather than rushing past it, worth allowing it to slow our assumptions about the direction of history and the automatic beneficence of civilizational development. There is a further dimension to this comparison that is worth exploring slowly, because it touches on something that goes beyond the social and legal and economic, something that reaches into the deeper registers of human experience. It is the question of connection, not only connection to other people, but connection to the natural world, to the rhythms of the landscape, to the cycle of seasons and the movements of animals and the slow processes of growth and decay that constitute the biological world in which human beings evolved, and to which our bodies and minds remain attuned at a level below conscious thought. The Pleistocene woman lived in intimate daily contact with the natural world in a way that medieval European peasant women, for all their outdoor labour, did not quite replicate. The hunter-gatherer woman's relationship with the landscape was not the relationship of someone working land that belonged to a lord and owed a portion of its produce to a church. It was the relationship of a person for whom the landscape was both home and library and pharmacy and larder, all at once, a relationship built through direct experience and embodied knowledge accumulated over a lifetime of attentive engagement. She knew the smell of rain coming before it arrived, not as a poetic observation, but as a practical piece of information relevant to where the band should camp and what routes would remain passable. She knew the sounds of the night well enough to distinguish the sounds that required attention from the sounds that did not. She knew which plants growing near water sources had properties that could reduce a fever or clean a wound, knowledge that had been tested by generations of women before her, who had observed which treatments worked and which did not, and had passed those observations forward through teaching and story. This kind of knowledge, rooted in direct experience of a specific landscape over a lifetime of attentive engagement, is a form of intelligence that formal education cannot simply replace. It is the kind of intelligence that our species developed over millions of years of living in direct contact with the natural world. And it is the kind of intelligence that settled civilization, with its walls and its specialization and its division between those who manage the land and those who own it, tends to displace and devalue. In a hunter-gatherer band, this knowledge was distributed among the members of the group, held collectively and shared freely, and the women who held significant portions of it were recognized as valuable for that reason. In the medieval village, the women who held similar forms of traditional knowledge, knowledge of plant medicines, knowledge of midwifery, knowledge of the agricultural practices that had sustained their families across generations, occupied an ambiguous social position. Their knowledge was practically necessary. Without the midwives and the herb women and the women who knew how to manage the small-scale agricultural and household production that fed families through lean seasons, the communities they served could not have functioned. But their social standing did not always reflect the practical necessity of their knowledge, and in the later medieval period, the institutional church's increasing concern with what it categorized as superstition, and with the spirituals, the dangers of relying on informal female knowledge rather than on the formal knowledge of male clergy, created conditions in which the very same traditional knowledge that had made women socially valuable in the earlier periods began to be reframed as suspicious, as potentially connected to the demonic, as requiring surveillance and control by the institutional church. The consequences of this shift would become fully visible only in the early modern period, in the wave of witch trials that swept across Europe from the 15th through the 17th centuries, in which tens of thousands of people, the overwhelming majority of them women, were accused of witchcraft, tried, and in many cases executed. But the roots of that catastrophe lie in the gradual medieval erosion of the social legitimacy of female traditional knowledge and the increasing institutional anxiety about women who operated the spaces between the officially sanctioned and the unofficial, the borderlands of medieval social life where female knowledge and female authority had historically found their most important expression. A Pleistocene woman did not face this kind of institutional anxiety directed at her knowledge and her practices. Her knowledge was simply knowledge, embedded in the collective knowledge of the band, valued for its practical utility, and passed on to the next generation as part of the ordinary process of a community reproducing its collective capability for survival. There was no institutional apparatus to declare it suspicious or to categorize it as dangerous to the proper social order. The proper social order, such as it was negotiated face to face among the people who shared a camp, and it was not maintained by any institution with the power to systematically delegitimize the knowledge and practices of half the population. When we consider all of these dimensions together, the legal, the economic, the ideological, the relational, the epistemological, a picture emerges that is more advanced and more surprising than either the simple narrative of progress or the counter-narrative of decline can capture. It is a picture of human societies as deeply contingent arrangements, shaped by environmental conditions and historical accidents, and the cumulative decisions of many generations, arrangements that can expand freedom in some dimensions while contracting it in others, that can enable some human capacities while suppressing others, and that do not automatically tend toward the greater flourishing of everyone within them, simply by becoming more complex and more materially productive. The specific freedoms that Pleistocene hunter-gatherer women enjoyed were not the product of some conscious choice by ancient people to create an egalitarian social order. They were the product of structural conditions, of the material constraints and social dynamics of small mobile groups living without accumulated property or formal institutions. They were real freedoms, but they were incidental to the structural conditions that produced them, not ideals that were deliberately pursued or values that were consciously upheld. When the structural conditions changed with the emergence of agriculture and the accumulation of property and the development of institutional religion and formal law, those freedoms largely disappeared, not because anyone necessarily intended to eliminate them, but because the new structural conditions created new incentives and new forms of social organization that were incompatible with them. Understanding this helps us see both the Pleistocene past and the medieval past more clearly, without either romanticizing the one or demonizing the other. The Pleistocene woman who enjoyed more social autonomy than a medieval descendant was not living in a utopia. She was living in conditions of physical hardship and constant uncertainty that we would find extremely difficult. But some of the things that made her life hard were not the same things that made medieval women's lives constrained, and some of the freedom she had, incidental products of structural conditions she had no power to choose, were freedoms that the medieval world had lost without quite knowing what had been lost. This is the kind of observation that is most useful when it is held quietly, without being pressed into the service of any simple political argument, allowed simply to complicate our assumptions and deepen our sense of what history actually contains. History is not a story of steady progress in any simple sense. It's a story of transformation, of gains and losses, of freedoms expanded in some dimensions as they are contracted in others, of human societies finding different partial solutions to the permanent challenges of organizing collective life in ways that allow the individuals within it to live fully and well. The Pleistocene woman sitting by a fire in the African grassland, nursing her child in the light of a fire that pushed back the darkness for a few hours before the long African night reasserted itself, was not an inferior version of the woman she would eventually become through the long processes of agricultural development and civilizational accumulation. She was fully human in the deepest sense. Her brain was our brain. Her emotional life was our emotional life. Her capacity for the specific pleasures and pains of human social existence was the same capacity we carry in ourselves today, inherited from her and from the long chain of women who came before her, extending back through time to the first members of our species and beyond, into the primate past from which our lineage emerged. And if the archaeological and anthropological evidence is to be believed, she moved through her social world with a degree of recognized agency and personal standing that her descendant 10,000 generations later, sitting in a cold stone house in 13th century France, subject to laws she had no hand in making and religious doctrine she had no voice in forming, would have found, if she could have imagined it at all, something very much like freedom. That is not a final conclusion. The history of women, like the history of humanity more broadly, does not resolve into clean conclusions. It resolves into questions held open, into an ongoing recognition that the conditions under which human beings live and the freedoms they enjoy or are denied are not fixed feature of the natural order, but contingent products of human choices, human institutions, and human structural arrangements that have changed dramatically across the long span of our species' history, and that will, inevitably, continue to change. What the comparison between Stone Age women and medieval women offers us is not a blueprint or a destination. It offers us something more valuable and more modest, a deepening of perspective, an expansion of the sense of what has been possible in human social life, of the range of arrangements that human beings have actually lived within, of the distance between what has been and what must be. The conditions of the Pleistocene cannot be recreated, and it would be neither possible nor desirable to attempt to recreate them. But the knowledge that human social organization has contained within it at various points in the deep past arrangements more compatible with female agency and autonomy than what the medieval world offered is a form of knowledge that belongs to everyone who cares about the long human story. Let that knowledge settle slowly into the quieter parts of the mind. Let it rest there alongside all the other quiet facts of a history that is older and stranger and more full of unexpected possibilities than any simple story can contain. The night is long, and the human past is longer still, and somewhere in the distance between where we have been and where we might go, there are always more questions worth carrying gently into the dark. There is another dimension of this comparison that deserves unhurried attention, one that concerns the relationship between the human body and the demands placed upon it in different historical periods. We've already touched on the skeletal evidence that documents the physical costs of agricultural labour for early farming populations, but it is worth going deeper into what the bodies of ancient women can tell us about specific conditions of their lives, because the body records experience in ways that words and laws and religious doctrines do not. Bioarchaeology, the study of human skeletal remains in their archaeological context, has transformed our understanding of ancient health and daily life over the past several decades. Early bioarchaeologists were primarily concerned with questions of disease and nutrition, with identifying the marks left on bone by specific pathological conditions. But the field has grown to encompass a much broader range of questions, including questions about activity patterns, about the physical demands of different kinds of work, about childhood stress and adult health trajectories, and about the ways in which social inequality is inscribed in the bodies of those who experience it. The bones of Pleistocene women speak of extraordinary physical capability. The femora, the major bones of the upper leg, of some Pleistocene women show bone density and muscular attachment markings that exceed those of modern female athletes in elite sports. These are the bones of people who walked enormous distances regularly and who carried substantial loads, not as extraordinary effort but as the ordinary texture of daily life. The humeri, the upper arm bones, show muscular development consistent with the repeated motion of digging, of processing plant foods, of carrying. These were physically powerful people whose bodies had been shaped by a lifetime of varied and demanding physical activity. This physical capability was not merely a response to harsh external conditions. It was also a form of embodied competence, a reservoir of practical ability that translated into social standing in a world where physical capability and practical knowledge were the primary foundations of contribution to group survival. A woman who could walk 15 miles in a day, carrying a substantial load of plant foods, who had the strength and endurance to dig deep for water roots in a dry landscape, who could process raw plant materials into edible form with efficiency and skill, was visibly, undeniably useful to her group in ways that everyone around her could see, and that she herself knew, and could take a kind of quiet pride in. The bones of medieval peasant women tell a different story. They show the marks of specific repetitive labours concentrated in particular joints and muscle groups, the rotator cuff damage consistent with years of overhead threshing, the spinal compression consistent with years of bent-over work, the hand and wrist changes consistent with years of spinning and grinding, These are the marks of specialization, of labor that was not the varied engagement with a diverse physical challenge that hunter-gatherer life required, but the narrowing of physical life into particular channels, determined not by individual capability or preference, but by the social organization of agricultural production. The medieval peasant woman's body was shaped by her social position in a more visible and direct way than the hunter-gatherer woman's body, and what it was shaped into was not physical capability in the broad sense, but endurance in the specific sense, the ability to sustain particular forms of physical effort across long periods of time. There's something here about what kind of physical life produces what kind of relationship to one's own body. The hunter-gatherer woman whose broad physical capability was the direct expression of her contribution to group survival had, we might imagine, a relationship to her own body as a capable and trusted instrument, something that worked for her in the world and that she knew through direct experience of its abilities and limits. The medieval peasant woman whose body bore the marks of specific social labor, whose physical life was shaped by the demands of a production system she did not control, and whose products largely went to others through rent and tithe and the demands of the feudal hierarchy, had, we might imagine, a somewhat different relationship to her own body, one in which the body's labor was less clearly her own, less clearly the expression of her own capability, and more clearly the raw material from which others extracted value. This is, of course, speculation about inner experience, about the subjective dimension of physical life that cannot be directly accessed from the archaeological record. But the physical evidence is real, and the question it raises about the relationship between physical labor, social position, and the experience of one's own body is worth sitting with. The question of children and motherhood is another dimension of this comparison that requires careful attention. For most of human history, the bearing and rearing of children was one of the central organizing facts of women's lives. In both Pleistocene hunter-gatherer societies and in medieval European society, women bore children, nursed them, and devoted enormous energy to their survival and development. The biological reality of human reproduction didn't change between the Stone Age and the medieval period. And what changed was the social context within which that biological reality was experienced and managed. In hunter-gatherer societies, the evidence suggests that women nursed their infants for extended periods, often 3 or 4 years, and this extended nursing, combined with the physical demands and modest caloric surplus of hunter-gatherer life, acted as a natural birth spacing mechanism that limited the total number of children a woman would bear across her reproductive years to a more manageable number than what many agricultural women experienced. The average number of live births for a hunter-gatherer woman appears from demographic studies to have been around 4 to 6, though infant and child mortality meant that many of these children did not survive to adulthood. The loss was real, and the grief was real, but the physical demand of successive pregnancies was moderated by the natural spacing that extended nursing provided. In medieval Europe, the transition to weaning infants earlier, partly because agricultural diets provided more carbohydrate-rich foods that could be used as early supplemental feeding, and partly because of the economic pressures of agricultural households that needed women's labour to resume sooner, meant that the natural birth spacing effect of extended nursing was diminished, and medieval women often experience more closely spaced pregnancies and higher total numbers of births. The physical toll of repeated pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation, compounded by the nutritional stresses of a diet less diverse than the hunter-gatherer diet, is recorded in the skeletal remains of medieval women in ways that paint a picture of bodies under sustained reproductive stress. Childbirth itself, in both periods, was a significant risk for women, but the specific conditions of medieval childbirth, typically occurring in domestic spaces with female attendants and without access to medical intervention in cases of complication, were not necessarily worse than the conditions of Pleistocene childbirth in terms of the available assistance. In both cases, birth was attended by other women whose knowledge of the process came from accumulated experience and oral tradition. In both cases, the primary intervention available in cases of serious complication was limited. The difference lies not in the immediate circumstances of the birth event itself, but in what happened before and after. In the nutritional status of the woman going into labour, shaped by years of dietary adequacy or inadequacy, and in the social support available to her in the weeks and months of recovery and nursing that followed. A hunter-gatherer woman who'd given birth had around her the members of her band, women who had themselves given birth and who understood the demands of recovery, who shared the labour of daily life during the period when the new mother was most in need of support, who held the infant and allowed the mother rest in the casual and immediate way that small groups of people who spend all their time together naturally provide support to one another. A medieval peasant woman who had given birth returned to her household labour as quickly as the combined pressures of economic necessity and social expectation allowed. In a domestic setting that might offer less of the casual communal support that the band structure provided. The social organisation of childcare more broadly is another significant point of comparison. In hunter-gatherer societies, the care of children was distributed across the band in ways that researchers studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies have documented extensively. Alloparenting, the care of children by adults other than the biological parents, is a feature of human child-rearing that appears to be universal across cultures and that has deep roots in our evolutionary history. Sarah Blaffer, Herdy's work on the evolution of human cooperative breeding has argued persuasively that the unusually intensive demands of human child-rearing, producing children who require years of dependent care before they're able to function independently, could not have been met by individual mothers working alone or even by nuclear family units, and that the evolution of human cooperative breeding, the systematic involvement of grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated band members in the care of children, was a fundamental development in human evolution that shaped not only our social organisation, but our cognitive and emotional development as well. In the context of hunter-gatherer band life, this distributed childcare meant that a woman was never entirely alone in the domestic work of raising young children. The other women of the band were present, available, and expected to help, not as a special favour, but as the ordinary expression of the reciprocal social obligations that knit the band together. Grandmothers played a particularly important role, and the anthropological observation that postmenopausal women in hunter-gatherer societies make substantial contributions to the nutrition and care of their grandchildren has been developed into what researchers call the grandmother hypothesis, the argument that the evolution of human postmenopausal lifespan was driven by the adaptive advantage of having older women available to support the reproductive success of their daughters and granddaughters. In the more dispersed social structure of medieval agricultural communities, this kind of dense communal childcare network was harder to maintain. Extended families sometimes lived in close proximity, and grandmothers did contribute to childcare in medieval households in ways that historical records document. But the structural conditions of agricultural life, which could scatter family members across different villages as they married and established households, which could remove the women of a family from each other's immediate presence for years at a time, and which organised daily labour around the demands of agricultural production rather than around the needs of the community's children, made the dense and immediate communal childcare of the hunter-gatherer band difficult to replicate. This matters because the experience of early motherhood, the specific physical and emotional demands of caring for very young children, is profoundly shaped by the support available from the social community. A woman caring for an infant within a dense network of experienced and willing helpers is having a qualitatively different experience of early motherhood than a woman caring for an infant largely alone or with minimal assistance. The difference is not only practical, not only a matter of getting more sleep or having hands free for other tasks. It is a difference in the social embedding of one of the most demanding experiences of human life, a difference in whether the experience of new parenthood is a solitary burden or a shared communal adventure. We might also consider the question of knowledge transmission across generations of women, and what the different social structures of Pleistocene and medieval life meant for the ways in which women learned from each other and built on each other's accumulated experience. In the hunter-gatherer band, the transmission of knowledge between generations of women happened in the context of daily shared activity. A young woman learned to gather, to process, to care for children, to manage social relationships, to navigate the landscape and identify its resources, by working alongside older women who were themselves engaged in these activities every day. The transmission was not formal, not structured around scheduled lessons, but continuous and embedded in the fabric of daily shared life. This meant that the knowledge being transmitted was not only the practical skills of subsistence, important as those were, but the entire texture of how to be a woman in this particular community, how to navigate its social dynamics, how to build and maintain relationships, how to exercise whatever forms of influence were available, how to manage the inevitable conflicts and losses and difficulties of human social life. This was comprehensive education in everything that mattered for a life well lived in the specific social world the young woman would inhabit, and it happened in the company of people who had known her since birth and who had a stake in her success. In the medieval agricultural setting, the transmission of knowledge between generations of women was also real and important, but it operated in conditions that were sometimes less favourable to comprehensive and continuous transmission. The disruptions of agricultural life, the deaths of mothers and grandmothers, the geographical separation of families through marriage and migration, the replacement of some forms of female traditional knowledge by the formal institutional knowledge of the church. All of these created conditions in which the chain of transmission could be broken or attenuated in ways that the tight communal life of the hunter-gatherer band made less likely. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific question of how women in different historical contexts understood their own place in the long human story, their relationship to the women who had come before them and the women who would come after. In the hunter-gatherer band, this understanding was immediate and personal. The older women of the band were known individually, their histories known in the way that the histories of intimates are known through years of shared experience and accumulated story. The young woman could see directly the trajectory of a woman's life across the generations present in the band, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest infant, and could place herself in that trajectory with a directness and immediacy that more complex and dispersed social structures make difficult. In medieval European society, women's understanding of their place in the human story was mediated primarily by the theological framework of the Church, which offered a particular narrative about women's nature, women's history, and women's destiny that was not constructed by women or from women's experience, but by male theologians from a tradition of philosophical and religious thought that had its origins in cultures and historical contexts very different from the lives of medieval peasant women. The women of the medieval village could not see their own lives reflected in the official stories their culture told about women. They could see Eve, who brought sin into the world. They could see the Virgin Mary, whose impossible combination of virginity and motherhood placed her in category that no actual woman could inhabit. They could see the female saints, whose holiness was typically expressed through the overcoming or denial of their female nature. What they could not easily see, in the official cultural stories available to them, was a dignified and honest reflection of their own experiences working, bearing, grieving, hoping, managing, enduring women. The informal culture for medieval women, the stories and songs and practices that circulated outside the official channels of church and court, did contain such reflections, and historians of medieval women's culture have worked to recover them from fragments and traces that survived despite their unofficial status. But the official culture worked against them, and the woman who found her experience most honestly reflected in unofficial female culture, rather than in the official theological narrative, was navigating a minor but real form of cultural alienation in her own society. This, too, is a form of constraint that has no precise equivalent in the Pleistocene. The hunter-gatherer woman's culture was her culture in a very direct sense, not divided into official and unofficial registers, not filtered through institutions that she did not control and that did not represent her. The stories a community told, the rituals it performed, the values it expressed in its daily life were shaped by the full participation of all its members, women included, in the ongoing process of cultural reproduction that every human community engages in simply by living together and talking to each other and making meaning from shared experience. As we trace these threads through the long fabric of human history, following them from the deep past into the medieval period and considering what they tell us about the conditions under which women have lived and the forms of freedom and constraint they have encountered, we arrive to recognition that is quiet and important. The recognition is that freedom, in the sense of the conditions under which human beings are able to live fully as themselves, to contribute and be recognized, to choose and to move, to exit difficulty and enter possibility, is not something that arrives automatically with the passage of time or the increase of material prosperity. It is something that depends on specific structural conditions, specific social arrangements, specific distributions of power and recognition, and practical capability. The Pleistocene did not offer those conditions as a gift or an ideal. It offered them as an incidental consequence of the particular structural features of small group mobile life in a world without accumulated property or formal institutions. Those structural features also produced hardship and danger and early death. The conditions that produced more female autonomy and more female social recognition also produced lives that were, by our standards, physically brutal and materially limited in ways that most of us would find very difficult to live with. but the incidental freedom that those conditions created was real. It was experienced by real women who moved through the world with a degree of recognized personal standing and practical agency that many women in later historical periods would not have. And the loss of that freedom as civilization developed, the gradual and largely inadvertent subordination of women that accompanied the transition to agriculture, and the development of institutional religion and formal law was a real loss, even as it was accompanied by real gains in other dimensions of human life. Recognizing this does not require us to choose between the Stone Age and the medieval period, or between either of them and the present. It requires us only to take seriously the possibility that the story of human freedom is not a simple story of progress, that different historical periods have offered different partial answers to the question of how human beings can live well together, and that the conditions under which women specifically have been able to live most fully as themselves have varied enormously across the long span of human history, in ways that do not map simply onto any single narrative of improvement or decline. The woman of the Pleistocene and the woman of medieval Europe were both fully human. They both laughed and grieved. They both loved their children with the fierce, particular love that evolution had built into human parental feeling. They both navigated the social dynamics of their communities with the intelligence and attention that human beings have always brought to the work of living together. They both made meaning from their lives in the ways that human beings invariably do, finding beauty in the particular beauties available to them, comfort in the particular comforts their world provided, connection in the particular forms of connection their social arrangements made possible. But the structural conditions within which they lived those fully human lives were profoundly different. And those structural differences had real consequences for the kinds of freedom and the kinds of constraint each of them experienced as the texture of daily life. The Pleistocene woman was not freer in all dimensions or in all ways, but she was freer in some dimensions that matter, some dimensions that touch the most fundamental conditions of a dignified and self-directing human life. And acknowledging that, sitting with it quietly, allows us to see both the past and the present with something a little more like clear eyes, a little more willing to recognize what has been gained and what has been lost across the long human story. The night sky above the Pleistocene camp and the night sky above the medieval village were the same sky, the same ancient light, travelling the same impossible distances to reach the same human eyes looking upward from the brief and particular light of a human life. The women who looked up at that sky in each of those times and places looked with the same eyes, the same deep evolutionary inheritance of curiosity and wonder that has always been part of what it means to be human. They saw the same stars, they did not know the same world, and in that difference, patiently examined, lie some of the most important questions that the long human story still has to offer. Rest now with those questions. Let the stars be enough. Let the ancient sky do what it has always done, which is to make the immediate world feel briefly small, and the larger story feel briefly close, the way only genuine distance and genuine darkness can. The story of human women is old beyond imagining and full beyond telling, and what we have traced here tonight is only one quiet thread of it, one slow path through an archive that will never be fully read. That incompleteness is not a failure. It is the honest condition of all genuine inquiry into the past. There's always more. The bones are always still speaking if we have the patience to listen. Let us return once more to the specific question of movement, because movement is one of the most profound and revealing differences between the two worlds we've been comparing. The Pleistocene hunter-gatherer woman moved. This was not incidental to her life. It was the fundamental structure of her life. Her relationship to place was not the agricultural relationship of ownership and permanent attachment, but the forager's relationship of intimate familiarity with a large territory through which the band moved in seasonal patterns that reflected the movements of the landscape's resources. She knew many places. She had walked to them and from them many times, carrying children and food and the tools of her daily life. The landscape was not her property, but it was, in a deep and experiential sense, her world, known through the soles of her feet and the muscles of her back and the accumulated observations of years of attentive travel through it. This relationship to movement and landscape had social and psychological dimensions that are worth considering carefully. A person who moves regularly through a large territory, who knows many places and many routes and many seasonal variations in the character of the land, has a different relationship to possibility than a person whose world is organized around a fixed point of settlement. The mobile person carries with her an implicit knowledge that the world is larger than any single location within it. That difficulty in one place does not mean permanent entrapment, that the horizon is something to walk toward rather than something to press against from the inside of a fixed enclosure. This is not merely a metaphor. For the Pleistocene woman, the ability to move was a practical resource, a real option that shaped the range of choices available to her in ways both practical and psychological. The medieval peasant woman's relationship to movement was profoundly different. She was, in most cases, legally and practically bound to a specific place. The feudal system created legal obligations that tied serfs to the land of their lord, and while the legal severity of these bonds varied across regions and centuries, the practical reality for most medieval peasant women was that movement away from their home village required permission, resources, and social support that are rarely available. The world beyond the immediate landscape of the village and its surrounding fields was not a familiar territory to be traversed in seasonal patterns, but an alien and often dangerous space, associated with the exceptional circumstances of pilgrimage, flight from catastrophe, or forced displacement. This confinement to a fixed place was not only a practical constraint, it shaped the entire imaginative and psychological world of the medieval peasant woman in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. When your world is organized around a fixed point, the conditions of that fixed point take on a permanence and a totality that conditions in a mobile world do not. The difficult marriage, the cruel lord, the community that has judged you harshly. These are permanent features of the landscape for the woman who cannot leave, in a way that they're not for the woman who knows that their next camp is a few days' walk away, and that the social world of their next camp will be somewhat different from the social world of this one. The landscape itself, which for the Pleistocene woman was a source of knowledge and a kind of freedom, a world so large that it could always offer something new to someone paying close enough attention, was for the medieval peasant woman a productive resource to be managed and exhausted and competed over. The site of the agricultural labour on which her family's survival depended, and from which the lord and the church extracted their shares through rent and tithe. The same fields that fed her family also fed the lord's household, and supported the institutional church. The labour she put into those fields returned to her in the form of survival, but only after the prior claims of the more powerful had been satisfied. This is a relationship to landscape and to one's own labour that has no equivalent in hunter-gatherer life, where the concept of prior claims by more powerful others on the resources of the landscape, while not entirely absent in the form of territorial rights recognized between bands, was not institutionalized in the systematic way that feudal agriculture required. The question of what women ate, and how they ate, and with whom they ate, is another dimension of this comparison that reveals significant differences between the two worlds. Food in hunter-gatherer societies was typically shared within the band through systems of obligatory sharing that anthropologists have documented extensively. The hunter who returned with a meat was expected to distribute it to the other members of the band according to established rules of sharing, and failure to share appropriately was one of the most socially sanctioned behaviors in hunter-gatherer communities across many different cultures and continents. This obligatory sharing meant that the caloric resources of the band were distributed in ways that reflected collective survival needs, rather than individual accumulation, and that women and children had recognized claims on the band's food supply that were not simply dependent on the goodwill of particular men. In medieval agricultural households, the distribution of food within the family was not governed by norms of obligatory sharing, but by the authority of the household head, typically the husband and father, who controlled the household's food supply as part of his broader control over household resources. The historical evidence suggests that in conditions of food scarcity, which were not infrequent in medieval agricultural communities, it was women and children who were most likely to see their shares reduced, while adult men maintained their access to the caloric resources needed to sustain the heavy agricultural labour on which the household's survival depended. The bones of medieval women show isotopic signatures consistent with lower protein consumption than those of medieval men from the same communities in some studies, suggesting that the distribution of food within medieval households was not equal, and that women bore a disproportionate share of nutritional scarcity. This nutritional inequality was not merely a matter of calories. Protein is essential for a wide range of biological functions, and chronic mild protein deficiency, compounded by the nutritional demands of repeated pregnancy and lactation, can have significant effects on the health and vitality of women over a lifetime. The bones of medieval women record this nutritional history in their density and composition, in the markers of childhood stress that indicate periods of nutritional inadequacy during the years when bones and teeth were developing, in the early arthritis and the worn joints that speak of bodies working hard on insufficiently nourished frames. The Pleistocene woman's diet, while it came with its own risks and uncertainties, was in many ways more nutritionally adequate than the grain-heavy diet of the medieval peasant. The diversity of plant foods that a skilled gatherer could access across the seasons, supplemented by animal products from hunting, and from the opportunistic collection of insects and eggs and small animals, provided a range of micronutrients that grain-based diets struggled to replicate. The bones of Pleistocene women, where they are well enough preserved for analysis, tend to show level of bone density and nutritional adequacy that compare favourably with those of agricultural women from later periods, despite the generally harder physical conditions of Pleistocene life. There is something quietly remarkable about this. The woman who lived without walls, without a guaranteed food supply, without the institutional protections of church or law, eating whatever the landscape offered in a particular season in a particular year, was in certain measurable physical respects better nourished than the woman who lived within the more complex and productive system of medieval agriculture. The system that produced more food in aggregate did not distribute that food in ways that served the physical needs of all its members equally, and women, whose formal social standing gave them less claim on the system's outputs, often bore the costs of that unequal distribution in their own bodies. Returning now to a broader perspective, one that encompasses all of what we have been slowly tracing through these comparisons, there is a philosophical dimension to this history that is worth articulating explicitly, even at the risk of stating something that the evidence has already made implicit. It is the dimension that concerns what we might call the social recognition of personhood, the degree to which a social system acknowledges and responds to the full humanity of its members. This is not a concept that can be measured directly or precisely, but it can be approached through the accumulated evidence of how different social systems treated their female members across the range of dimensions we've been examining: legal standing, economic contribution and recognition, freedom of movement, participation in collective decision-making, control over one's own body and reproductive life, access to the communal resources of knowledge and support, protection from the formal ideological systems that legitimized or delegitimized different forms of female agency and capability. Across all of these dimensions, the picture that emerges from the comparison of Pleistocene hunter-gatherer life, a medieval European life, is one in which the formal recognition of women's personhood was, in certain important respects, more robust in the more ancient context. Not perfect, not equal, not free from the specific power imbalances that characterize small group social life, but more directly tied to the actual demonstrated contributions and capabilities of individual women, less mediated by formal institutional systems that systematically discounted those contributions, and less dependent on the ideological legitimacy granted or withheld by institutions that women did not control. The medieval system was more sophisticated, more complex, and in many ways more productive of the material and intellectual achievements that we associate with the advance of civilization. It produced universities and Gothic cathedrals and the beginnings of the legal systems that would eventually evolve into the frameworks of modern rights and governance. These were real achievements, and they matter. But they were achievements built on a foundation of social organization that systematically excluded or subordinated the majority of the female half of the human population, that extracted enormous labor from women while minimizing their formal social recognition, and that legitimized this extraction through religious and legal systems that invested enormous institutional authority in the proposition that this was the natural and divinely ordained condition of things. The Pleistocene did not invest any institutional authority in any proposition at all, because it had no institutions in that sense. Its social arrangements were not formally legitimized. They were simply lived, negotiated day by day among people who depended on each other for survival, and subject to the slow pressures of evolutionary selection that over hundreds of thousands of years had shaped human psychology, oriented toward the maintenance of social relationships, the recognition of individual contribution, and the informal but powerful mechanisms of social reciprocity that characterize small group human life everywhere it has been observed. In that untheorized, uninstitutionalized, philosophically unelaborated social world, women found conditions for their humanity that the more elaborate world of medieval Europe, for all its philosophical sophistication, frequently failed to provide. This is one of the stranger and more humbling conclusions that the long view of human history offers. The explicit articulation of human dignity and rights, including the rights of women, is a relatively recent development in the intellectual history of our species. but the informal, practical, structural recognition of women as full members of the human community, as contributors whose contributions matter and whose needs and preferences have genuine claim on the collective resources and attention of the group, is something far older, something woven into the fabric of the small group social life in which our species evolved and that many of our ancestors lived for most of the 200,000 years of our history on this earth. The bones are old, the stories are older than the bones. And the question they raise together, asked quietly in the space between one breath and the next, is always the same question. What do human beings owe each other? And how have the social arrangements we have built either honoured or failed that obligation across the long and various span of our time on earth? There is no simple answer to that question. There may be no final answer at all. But the asking of it, the serious and patient asking of it, guided by the evidence that patient inquiry has assembled across the long work of archaeological and anthropological research, is itself a form of honouring the women whose bones and whose lives and whose quiet daily competence have made the asking possible. Rest with that now. The question is old enough to hold the weight of sleep. Let it carry you gently toward the dark, toward the ancient quiet of the long human night, toward all the fires that have been lit and tended and allowed to go out across the years without number, that separate us from the first women who looked up at a sky that has not changed and wondered, as we still wonder, what it all means and where it goes, and whether the distance between where we are and where we might be is a distance that patient human effort can someday cross. There is one more thread to draw through before the story finds its resting place, one more quiet observation that the evidence of human history invites us to consider before we allow the weight of the night to settle fully. It is the observation about time itself, and about how different social worlds organize a person's experience of time. The hunter-gatherer woman lived in what we might call circular time, or at least a time that's organized around repetition and retousance, the seasonal cycles of the landscape, the cycles of gathering and moving and gathering again, the cycles of birth and growth, and aging and death, that she could observe directly in the lives of the people around her. Cycles that were embedded in the natural world, and that the natural world made visible every year through the return of particular plants and the migrations of particular animals and the changing length of days across the months. This relationship to circular time, to time organized around return rather than around linear progression toward a fixed destination, is something that has deep roots in hunter-gatherer cultures worldwide, and that produces a distinctive relationship to the present moment. If time circles back, if the resources that were here last season will return again next season, if the people who have died are in some sense still present in the ongoing life of the community, then the present moment has a different weight and a different completeness than it has in a framework that organizes time as linear progress toward an endpoint, either the kingdom of God or historical development or some other form of future destination. The medieval woman lived in explicitly linear time, in the theological framework of a history that had a beginning in creation, a turning point in the incarnation, and an ending in the Last Judgment, a time moving from origin to destination through the medium of human suffering and divine grace. This framework had beautiful and consoling aspects. It gave individual suffering a meaning and a context, placing it within a story larger than any individual life and pointing toward a resolution that transcended the difficulties of the present. It made the hardship of a hard life legible as something other than mere meaningless pain, as a participation in a larger story that was moving, however slowly, toward its appointed conclusion. But it also organized the present moment as a station on the way to somewhere else, a temporary condition to be endured in hope of what would come after, and this orientation toward a future destination rather than a present completeness had consequences for how one lived in the present, how one experienced the texture of daily life, how one held the immediate reality of one's own existence in relationship to the larger narrative frame within which it was placed. For women specifically, whose prescribed role in the theological story was primarily passive, primarily defined by waiting and endurance and the subordination of individual will to divine and male authority. The linear time of medieval Christian theology was a framework that organized present experience around the deferral of full humanity to a future that existed beyond the present life. The hunter-gatherer woman, living in the circular time of seasonal return, had no theological framework that organized her present experience as a deferral. She was not waiting for a destination. She was living where she was, moving through time as it moved through her, embedded in the present reality of the landscape and the community with a directness and a completeness that the future-oriented framework of medieval Christian time did not quite allow. This is not a claim that hunter-gatherer life was spiritually superior, or that its relationship to time was simply better. It is an observation that different relationships to time produce different experiences of the present moment, and that the experience of one's own present life is complete and real in itself, rather than as a preparation for something else, has consequences for how a person inhabits their own existence. We cannot know what the Pleistocene woman's experience of her own present moment felt like from the inside. We cannot recover her inner life from the stones and bones she left behind, but we can observe that the structural conditions of her life, the immediacy of her contribution, the direct recognition of her capability, the embeddedness of her daily experience in the social world of people who knew her and depended on her, create conditions more favorable to the experience of present completeness than the structural conditions of medieval peasant life, which organized female experience around deference, around waiting, around the present life as a passage toward a destination that was always elsewhere. There is a particular kind of freedom in being allowed to inhabit your own present life as something real and complete, rather than being required to experience it primarily as preparation for something else, or as a temporary condition awaiting resolution. It is a freedom that does not require exceptional circumstances or exceptional individuals. It is available, in principle, to ordinary people in ordinary conditions, but it requires social conditions that recognize and respond to the present reality of individual persons, that do not systematically organize the experience of half the population around deferral and waiting, and the legitimacy of others' claims on their time and energy and body. Those conditions were imperfect in the Pleistocene, and they were often absent in medieval Europe. The long human story is the story of our slow and halting and repeatedly interrupted effort to create social arrangements that honor the present reality of all the people who live within them, that extend the practical recognition of full humanity to everyone who needs it and everyone who deserves it, which is everyone. We have not finished that work. We have not come close to finishing it. But the knowledge that some of the conditions most favorable to that recognition are old, far older than civilization, woven into the social fabric of the kind of small communities in which our species evolved, is a strange and quiet comfort. It means that the capacity for that recognition is not an achievement that has to be built from nothing. It is something that our deep nature already knows how to do, that our social psychology already reaches toward, that the long history of our species already contains in its most ancient practices. The question is only whether the complex social arrangements we have built on top of that ancient foundation have made it easier or harder to express what we already know in the deepest part of ourselves about what human beings owe each other. Let that be the last thought before sleep, not a conclusion, not an answer, only a recognition that the question is old and that the capacity to honour it is older still, and that somewhere beneath all the complexity of history and law and institution and ideology, the simple social knowledge of a small group of people moving together through a world that demanded everything of them, and that they met every day with everything they had, is still present in us, waiting to be remembered, waiting to shape the arrangements we build for ourselves and for the women who will come after us, in whatever world those arrangements will make possible. The fire is low, the camp is quiet, the stars have not changed. Sleep now. And yet there remains one final observation that cannot be left unsaid, one quiet thread that runs beneath everything we have traced through this long and patient exploration of two very different worlds separated by thousands of years of human history. It is the observation about what might be called the weight of being seen, the particular human need to be recognized by the community around you as a person whose existence matters, whose contributions register, whose suffering is real, and whose joy is worth celebrating. Every human being carries this need. It is part of our evolutionary inheritance, part of what our social species has always required in order to function well, in order to bring the full range of our capabilities to the work of living together. And the degree to which different social arrangements honour or fail to honour this need has consequences that reach into every corner of daily experience. The Pleistocene woman was seen. She was seen in the most direct and immediate sense by the people who shared her daily life, people who depended on what she knew and what she could do, who watched her gather and process and care and decide and negotiate, who knew her history and her capabilities and her particular way of moving through the world. She was not invisible. She was not legally non-existent. She was not defined primarily by her relationship to men whose authority over her was formally encoded in law and theology. She was a person, known and recognized as a person, in the specific and immediate way that small communities of mutually dependent people recognize each other. This recognition was imperfect, partial, and accompanied by all the ordinary frictions and injustices of human social life, but it was real, and real recognition, even imperfect and partial recognition, of the person's full humanity is something that no amount of material improvement can substitute for, and that no institutional sophistication can replace. The medieval woman was also seen by God, if the theology was to be believed, and by the Church that claimed to represent God's presence in human history. She was seen in the abstract categories of the institutional system that organized her legal and social existence. She was seen as wife, as daughter, as widow, as sinner, as penitent, a servant of the divine order. But the specific recognition of her as a particular person with a particular history and particular capabilities, the recognition that comes from years of shared daily life in a community small enough that individual contribution is directly visible, was something that the more dispersed and institutionalized social world of medieval agriculture made harder to sustain. In the vast anonymous structure of feudal Europe, where a peasant woman might be born and die in the same village without ever being known to anyone more than a few miles away, where the institutions that governed her life were managed by people who did not know her and would never meet her, where her legal existence was defined by abstract categories rather than by her actual presence and capability, the weight of being seen in the fullest sense, of having one's particular humanity recognized and responded to by the social world one inhabited, was something that had to be found in smaller spaces, in the informal networks of family and neighborhood, and the particular friendships that any human being can forge within whatever constraints their world imposes. Those informal spaces of recognition were real and important in medieval women's lives, and the historical work of recovering them has been one of the most valuable contributions of feminist scholarship to our understanding of the medieval past. But they existed in tension with and despite the formal structures of a social world organized around principles that systematically minimized formal female personhood, and the energy required to sustain personal recognition within a social world formally organized against it is energy that was not available for other things, energy spent compensating for a structural deficit that the Pleistocene woman did not face in the same form. This is, finally, what the comparison between these two very different worlds of human experience reveals most clearly and most quietly. Not that one world was simply better, or that one period of human history was simply freer, but that the conditions for a specific and important kind of human freedom, the freedom to be recognized as a full person by the community one inhabits, are not automatic products of material progress or intellectual sophistication, that they can be present in simple and ancient social arrangements, and absent from complex and institutionalized ones, and that the history of women is in part the history of what happens when social arrangements are built on foundations that either honor or fail to honor that most fundamental condition of human dignity. We carry that history with us, all of it, the ancient and the recent, the simple and the complex, the honored and the failed. It lives in the structural conditions of the societies we inhabit, and it lives in the deeper structure of the human social psychology that those conditions either align with or work against. Understanding it slowly and carefully and without simple conclusions is part of what it means to take history seriously, to let the past speak in its own voice, rather than only in the voice we wish it would use. The bones have spoken as much as they can tonight. The fire is out. The camp is still. The long human night folds gently over everything, over the ancient savannah and the medieval village, and the quiet room in which these words are finding their way, through the dark, towards sleep.